The story of the end begins at the camp of Beaver Hollow, a dark and damp cave hidden in the trees of Roanoke Ridge. The air here is heavy with the smell of wet earth, old leaves, and the cold metal of guns. This is a time when the group is no longer a family, but a collection of tired people who are afraid of the future. The atmosphere is quiet, tense, and filled with a feeling of waiting. The ground is soft with mud that clings to everyone's boots, making it feel like the land itself is trying to pull them down. You can hear the constant drip of water from the cave ceiling and the low rustle of the wind in the trees, making the camp feel like a cage. Dutch sits by himself, looking into the fire with eyes that no longer seem to see the people around him. He is thinking about a plan that doesn't exist anymore, while the others watch him and wonder when the end will come. This part of the history is a story of the fading light, a realization that the days of freedom are gone, and the law is closing in from every side. Arthur Morgan moves through the camp with a body that is failing him. He feels a constant weight in his chest and a sharpness in his breath that tells him his time is short. This is the era of the final realization, where the atmosphere is one of slow movement and quiet observation. You see the way he looks at the people he has protected for 20 years, realizing that he can no longer save them from Dutch's choices. The air tastes of wood smoke and the bitter scent of the medicine he takes to keep standing. This part of the history is a story of the broken trust, as Arthur watches Micah Bell whisper into Dutch's ear, filling his head with suspicion and anger. The sound of a horse neighing in the distance is a sharp note that breaks the silence, a noise that reminds them that they are being hunted. Arthur moves with a sturdy and measured might, but his heart is heavy with the knowledge that the man who raised him is becoming a stranger. Deep in the woods near the camp, the atmosphere becomes cramped and dangerous. The Pinkertons are everywhere, moving through the trees like shadows that never leave. This is the trial of the tightening circle, where the atmosphere is one of held breaths and the clicking of rifle hammers. The warriors find that the forest is no longer a place of safety, but a maze of traps and hidden enemies. The sound of a snapping twig is enough to make everyone reach for their holsters. The air is cold and carries the taste of rain and the dry scent of old bark. This part of the history is a realization that the world has moved on, and there is no place left for people who live by the gun. Arthur feels the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the cold against his skin, a feeling of total and grounded exhaustion as he tries to find a way to get the women and the children to safety before the final storm hits. At the center of the camp, the tension breaks during a heated argument about the money and the future. The atmosphere is violent, bright, and suffocating as voices are raised and hands move toward hilts. This is the trial of the divided house, where the atmosphere is one of sharp words and a sudden, terrible clarity. You see the way the group splits into two sides, those who still believe in Dutch's dream, and those who see the nightmare it has become. The sound of a chair being kicked over is a sharp and echoing snap, making the cave feel like it is about to collapse. This part of the history is a story of the final choice, where everyone must decide where their loyalty truly lies. Arthur stands in the middle, his voice a low and rasping growl, telling the others that the dream is dead, and the only thing left is to survive. Leaving the camp for a final mission, the journey leads to the burning fields of a nearby refinery. The atmosphere is vast, orange, and lethal, a realization that the violence is the only language left. This part of the history is a story of the last ride, where the atmosphere is one of heat and the roar of the flames. You see the way the fire reflects in the eyes of the men as they charge into the smoke, looking like ghosts from a war that ended long ago. The air is hot and carries the taste of oil and charred wood. The sound of the explosion at the factory is a deep and final boom, signaling that the end has arrived. Arthur moves with a sturdy and balanced power, his rifle clearing a path through the chaos, realizing that he is fighting for a future he will never see. The walk back to the cave after the battle is a story of a long and lonely path. The sun is setting behind the mountains, casting long, red shadows across the grass. This is a moment of raw and private reality. The atmosphere is somber and very still, a realization that the battle didn't change anything. This part of the history is a story of the final return, where the tradition of the homecoming meets the reality of the betrayal. The sound of his boots on the gravel is a sharp and respectful click, making Arthur feel solid and heavy as he prepares to face the man he once called father. He knows that Micah has been talking to the law, and he knows that Dutch is ready to believe the lie. Deep in the heart of the cave that night, the final trial of the first part takes place as Arthur stands before Dutch and Micah. The atmosphere is intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the family is gone. This is a story of the sovereignty of the final truth, where Arthur lays his cards on the table and tells Dutch what he has seen. The conversation is short and filled with the sound of the wind moving through the cave. The sound of the guns being drawn is a sharp and metallic note, signaling that the true enemy is no longer the law outside, but the man standing across the fire. They have reached the end of the road, and the only thing left is the final reckoning. The experience at Beaver Hollow ends with the sound of the Pinkertons arriving at the edge of the woods. The gray of the evening has led to a sovereignty of the dark night. They carry the weight of the years and the silence of the broken promise. The atmosphere is one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the group is now a path of the individual. The focus would now shift to the escape through the trees and the final duel on the mountain. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the blood into a world of final goodbyes and the closing of the legend, the final legacy of the first part of the fall is a story of the strength in the truth. You have seen the warrior stand his ground and find the courage within his own spirit. You have felt the sting of the cold and the weight of the betrayal. As the orange glow of the campfire fades into the shadows of the cave, and the first white light of the law's lanterns appears in the woods. You feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of Arthur Morgan finds its first resolution in the standing of his ground, leaving behind the world of the camp for a world of the mountain, the shadow, and a journey that is reaching its final peak. The chaos at the cave began with a wall of shouting and the sudden, sharp flashes of rifle fire from the trees. The law had finally arrived in force, and the darkness of the woods was lit up by the orange bursts of gunfire. Inside the camp, the atmosphere was frantic, loud, and filled with a deep sense of panic. The ground was slick with the evening rain, causing horses to slip and people to stumble as they tried to find their footing. The air tasted of wet gunpowder and the cold, damp scent of the earth being kicked up by boots. The sound of the world was a constant and heavy roar of shouting men and clashing metal, making the cave feel like a trap that was finally snapping shut. Arthur Morgan stood in the center of the storm, his rifle at his shoulder, realizing that the group he had lived with for his entire life was scattering like leaves in a gale. As the shootout moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted to one of desperate separation. In the confusion, people were running in different directions, some disappearing into the thick brush, while others were cornered by the lawmen. This was the era of the final scattering, where the atmosphere was one of high stakes and the sound of breaking branches. You see the way the shadows moved between the trees, making it impossible to tell friend from foe in the dim light of the lanterns. This part of the history is a story of the broken chain, a realization that the unity of the group was gone forever. The sound of a horse screaming in the dark was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that signaled the end of their safety. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured might, pushing his way through the chaos to find John. Feeling the steady heat of the bullets passing by and the raw weight of the duty he still felt toward his brother. Deep within a narrow gully behind the cave, Arthur and John found themselves pinned down by a group of men who had cut off the main trail. The atmosphere became cramped, cold, and lethal. They were trapped between the stone walls of the mountain and the advancing line of the law. This was the trial of the narrow pass, where the atmosphere was one of quick breaths and the smell of sulfur. The warriors found that the only way out was to climb, moving upward toward the high ridges where the air was thinner and the wind was stronger. The sound of the bullets hitting the rock face was a sharp and ringing snap, making the gully feel like the inside of a metal box. This part of the history is a realization that only one of them could make it out if they stayed together. Arthur felt the constant pressure of the sickness in his lungs and the steady pulse in his neck, a feeling of total and grounded resolve as he looked at the path ahead. At the edge of a high, rocky overlook, Arthur stopped and turned to face the men following them. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and cold as the moon broke through the clouds, lighting up the field of battle below. This was the trial of the final stand, where the atmosphere became one of absolute focus and the spray of gravel. Arthur told John that he had to go, that he had to find his wife and son and give them a life that didn't involve running. The sound of John's protest was a thin and fragile note, but it was drowned out by the sound of the approaching horses. This part of the history is a story of the ultimate gift, where the man who had lost his own future decided to buy one for his friend. Arthur moved with a sturdy and balanced power, handing over his belongings and pushing John toward the higher trail, realizing that his own journey was meant to end on this mountain. The fight on the ridge was a story of a lone wolf against the pack. Arthur took his position behind a large, flat stone, his eyes fixed on the trail below. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and deadly. A realization that he was the only thing standing between John and the end of his life. This part of the history is a story of the mountain guard, where the atmosphere is one of hard breathing and the steady clicking of a reloading rifle. You see the way the muzzle flashes lit up the dark trees, each one marking another second of time he had bought for his brother. The air was cold and carried the taste of iron and the dry scent of the high peaks. The sound of his own coughing was a deep and rasping rattle, signaling that the body was reaching its limit even as the spirit remained solid. The walk toward the peak after the law had been held back was a story of a fatting strength. Arthur was no longer running. He was crawling toward the light. The ground was cold and covered in a thin layer of frost that bit into his hands. This was a moment of raw and private finality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the war was over, and he was the only one left on the field. This part of the history is a story of the final climb, where the necessity of the sacrifice met the peace of the mountain. The sound of his boots dragging on the stone was a dull and respectful thud, making Arthur feel heavy in a world that was becoming weightless. He moved with a sturdy and measured power, reaching the highest point where he could see the sun beginning to touch the horizon. Deep in the heart of the ridge at dawn, the final trial of the second part took place as Arthur lay down against a cold stone and looked toward the east. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that he had done enough. This is a story of the sovereignty of the final rest, where he watched the colors of the sky change from black to a deep, burning orange. The conversation in his mind was quiet, filled with the faces of the people he had saved and the memories of the life he had lived. The sound of the wind moving over the grass was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the world would continue without him. He had held the line, and in the silence of the morning, he found the peace he had been searching for since the disaster began. The experience on the mountain ends with the sun rising over the valley, casting a golden light across the world. The dark of the cave had led to a sovereignty of the bright morning. He carried the weight of the effort and the silence of the victory. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the outlaws had reached its final destination. The focus would now shift to the life of John Marston and the years of peace that were bought with blood. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the survivor into a world of ranching, family, and the long shadow of the man who stayed behind, the final legacy of the second part of The Fall is a story of the strength in the goodbye. You have seen the warrior give everything to find the life for another. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the mountain. As the golden glow of the sunrise faded into the blue of the day, and the first birds began to sing in the trees, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of Arthur Morgan finds its second resolution in the rising sun, leaving behind the world of the gun for a world of the memory, the light, and a journey that had finally reached the summit. The story moves forward several years to the high, windy plains of the West, where the world is framed by the golden grass of the prairies and the blue peaks of the Great Divide. This is the beginning of a new chapter for the survivor, a time when the man who lived by the gun is trying to live by the plow. The atmosphere here is bright, open, and hopeful, yet filled with a quiet sense of hiding. The ground beneath John Marston's boots is a firm, dry earth that is beginning to bake under the summer sun, a far cry from the wet mud of the eastern swamps. The air tastes of dry sage, mountain water, and the clean scent of horsehair. The sound of the world is a low and constant rustle, the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass like a long sigh, making the entire plains feel like a colossal, natural clean slate. John leads his family toward a small ranch called Pronghorn, his hand feeling the rough wood of a fence post, realizing that in this new life, the danger is the memory that refuses to stay buried. As John takes a job as a ranch hand for a man named David Getz, the atmosphere shifts to one of humble toil. He finds a world of milking cows, building fences, and shoveling manure, tasks that are simple but require a steady and honest might. This is the era of the hidden name, where the atmosphere is one of sun-scorched skin and aching limbs. You see the way John struggles to look like a man who has never held a revolver, trying to keep his head down and his mouth shut. This part of the history is a story of the farmer's mask, a realization that to save his family, he must kill the outlaw within himself. The sound of the milk hitting the bucket is a sharp and rhythmic patter, a noise that marks the slow passage of a peaceful day. John moves with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the past still lingers, feeling the steady heat on his neck and the grit of the soil in his pores, a feeling of total and grounded effort. Deep within the barn at night, the atmosphere becomes quiet and reflective. John and Abigail live in a small shack, the wood smelling of old hay and cedar. This is the trial of the quiet life, where the atmosphere is one of soft whispers and muffled fears. The couple finds that the peace is fragile, a realization that the law and the old enemies are still out there in the dark. The sound of the crickets in the grass is a constant and high-pitched drone, making the ranch feel like the inside of a waiting watch. This part of the history is a realization that to be a father, John must learn to be a man of peace in a world that only taught him war. He feels the steady pulse in the wrist and the constant pressure of the responsibility against his chest, a feeling of total and grounded love. The calm is interrupted when a group of local outlaws, known as the Laramie Gang, begins to harass the ranch. The atmosphere is violent, bright, and tense as the riders burn a wagon and steal the cattle that John is supposed to protect. This is the trial of the returning instinct, where the atmosphere becomes one of rapid impacts and rising heat. John tries to stay back, his fingers itching for the weight of the steel he left in his trunk. The sound of the bandits laughing is a sharp and mocking note, a noise that cuts through the peace of the valley. This part of the history is a realization that some things cannot be solved with a shovel. He feels the steady ache in the hands and the constant pressure of the anger behind his eyes, a feeling of total and grounded restraint. When the ranch is attacked at night, the journey leads to the final breaking of the silence. John realizes that to protect the home of the man who gave him a chance, he must bring the ghost back one last time. The atmosphere is vast, dark, and lethal as John reaches into his old chest and pulls out the belt and the gun. This part of the history is a story of the awakened wolf, where the atmosphere is one of fast reflexes and cold intent. You see the way the moonlight reflects off the barrel of the revolver, looking like a silver tooth in the dark. The air is cold and carries the taste of gun oil and night air. The sound of the first shot being fired into the darkness is a sharp and final crack, signaling that the old life has not forgotten its way home. The walk back to the ranch house after the bandits are driven away is a story of a shattered peace. John stands in the yard, the gun still warm in his hand, as Abigail watches him from the porch with eyes full of fear. This is a moment of raw and existential grief. The atmosphere is somber and still, a realization that the act of saving the ranch has exposed who he really is. This part of the history is a story of the broken promise, where the identity of the ranch hand is lost to the identity of the killer. The sound of his boots on the hard-packed dirt is a sharp and respectful click, making John feel solid and heavy in a world that is no longer safe. He moves with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand touching the brim of his hat, realizing that the way of the sword is a shadow that follows the man, no matter how fast he runs. Deep in the heart of the ranch at night, the final trial of the third part takes place as Abigail decides to leave with Jack, unable to watch John return to his violent ways. The atmosphere is intimate, cold, and final, a realization that his attempt at a normal life has failed. This is a story of the sovereignty of the empty bed, where he realizes that the peace he bought with the gun has cost him the people he loves. The conversation is over. There is only the sound of the wind and the smell of the rain. The sound of a distant coyote howling on the ridge is a long and lonesome note, signaling that the true enemy was not the bandits, but the nature of the man himself. The experience at Pronghorn ends with John standing alone in the yard, looking toward the road where his family disappeared. The gold of the grass has led to a sovereignty of the gray dust. He carries the weight of the failed silence and the silence of the Savior. The atmosphere is one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that to get his family back, he must become a man of worth, a man who owns his own land. The focus would now shift to the building of Beecher's hope. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the timber into a world of construction, bank loans, and the final gathering of the old friends, the final legacy of the third part of the fall is a story of the strength in the second chance. You have seen the survivor try to walk the straight path and find the obstacle within his own past. You have felt the sting of the loss and the weight of the steel. As the orange glow of the ranch lantern fades into the evening shadows and the first stars appear over the plains, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of John Marston finds its third and grounded resolution in the return of the gun, leaving behind the world of the hand for a world of the land, the home, and a journey that is reaching its next great climb. The effort to build a permanent home began in the dusty streets of Blackwater, where John Marston walked into the bank to ask for a loan. This was a place of polished wood and quiet voices, a world where men in suits looked at him with suspicion. The atmosphere here was cold, formal, and heavy, with the smell of paper and ink. The ground beneath his boots was no longer the soft grass of the ranch, but a hard marble floor that made every step he took sound like a challenge. The air tasted of stale tobacco and old money. This part of the history is a story of the modern debt, a realization that the freedom of the wilderness was being replaced by the laws of the ledger. John signed his name with a steady hand, taking on a burden of debt to buy a piece of land known as Beecher's Hope. It was a scrubby, dry patch of earth filled with rocks and weeds, but to John, it was the foundation of the future he had promised Abigail. As John arrived at the property, the atmosphere shifted to one of daunting work. He found a land that looked like a graveyard for dead trees and tall, yellow grass. This was the era of the pioneer's sweat, where the atmosphere was one of sun-scalded skin and the dry taste of dirt. You see the way the wind whipped across the open plateau, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. This part of the history is a story of the lonely start, a realization that one man could not build a world on his own. The sound of the wind through the hollows was a low and constant moan, a noise that reminded him of how alone he was. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, clearing the first of the brush with a heavy axe, feeling the steady heat on his back and the raw weight of the task ahead. He was no longer an outlaw, but a man trying to carve a home out of a wilderness that didn't want him there. The isolation didn't last long, as the journey led to the reunion with old friends who had survived the fall. John found Uncle sleeping under a tree in town, and later discovered Charles Smith in a hidden boxing ring, fighting for coins to stay alive. The atmosphere became warm, dusty, and filled with a sense of shared history. The three men returned to the land, their horses moving in a slow and rhythmic clatter as they entered the gate of Beecher's Hope. This was the trial of the collective effort, where the atmosphere was one of campfire talk and the smell of roasting meat. The warriors found that they were no longer fighting for a cause or a leader, but for a place to finally rest. The sound of their voices laughing in the dark was a sharp and joyful note, making the empty field feel like the inside of a living home. This part of the history is a realization that the family was not dead. It was just waiting to be rebuilt. The actual building of the house was a story of wood, stone, and heavy iron nails. The atmosphere was bright, loud, and incredibly physical. The men spent their days lifting massive cedar beams and hammering shingles onto the roof under the burning western sun. This was the trial of the timber and the hammer, where the atmosphere was one of rhythmic pounding and the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine. You see the way the structure began to rise from the dirt, a skeleton of wood that would eventually hold the walls of a family's life. The sound of the saws cutting through the lumber was a sharp and grating hiss, making the plateau feel like the inside of a workshop. This part of the history is a story of the honest labor, where the callus on the hand was the mark of a man's worth. John felt the steady pulse in his arms and the constant pressure of the sun against his hat. A feeling of total and grounded pride as the house took shape. While the house was being built, a group of skinners, a violent and primitive gang of mountain men, began to watch the ranch from the trees. The atmosphere became cramped, cold, and threatening. The woods around Beecher's Hope felt like they were filled with eyes that didn't belong to animals. This was the trial of the encroaching dark, where the atmosphere was one of low whispers and the smell of old blood. The warriors found that their peace was once again being challenged by the world they had tried to leave behind. The sound of a distant, hooting owl that didn't sound like a bird was a thin and piercing note, signaling that they were being hunted. This part of the history is a realization that even a home of wood and stone needs a man with a gun to protect it. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, keeping his rifle close even while he held a hammer, realizing that the way of the land was a path of constant vigilance. The day the house was finally finished was a story of a quiet victory. John stood in the yard and looked at the building, the wood still pale and smelling of the forest. This was a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the physical part of the dream was complete. This part of the history is a story of the finished hearth, where the tradition of the wanderer met the reality of the settler. The sound of the door swinging on its iron hinges was a sharp and respectful click, making the house feel solid and heavy in a world that was always moving. John walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on the new floorboards like a promise being kept. He moves with a sturdy and measured power, touching the walls he had built with his own hands realizing that the way of the survivor was now a path of the provider. Deep in the heart of the new house at night, the final trial of the fourth part took place as John sat at the table and wrote a letter to Abigail. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that the only thing missing was the family he had built it for. This is a story of the sovereignty of the written word, where he told her that the house was ready and the past was buried in the dirt of the plateau. The conversation was one-sided, a silent plea for her to return and make the building a home. The sound of the wind hitting the new glass in the windows was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy of the loneliness was finally being pushed back. He had built the house, and now he had to wait for the heart of it to arrive. The experience at Beecher's Hope ends with John standing on the porch as a wagon appeared on the horizon. The gold of the sunset had led to a sovereignty of the purple evening. He carried the weight of the work and the silence of the waiting. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the Father. The focus would now shift to the return of Abigail and Jack, and the struggle to keep the ranch running during the hard years. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the harvest into a world of cattle, chores, and the final gathering of the ghosts of the past. The final legacy of the fourth part of the fall is a story of the strength in the built home. You have seen the outlaws put down the gun and pick up the hammer to find the foundation within their own sweat. You have felt the sting of the sun and the weight of the timber. As the red glow of the ranch fire faded into the shadows of the porch and the first stars appeared over the high plains, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of John Marston finds its fourth resolution in the completion of the house, leaving behind the world of the camp for a world of the barn, the field, and a journey that was finally finding its anchor in the earth. The work of the ranch at Beecher's Hope settled into a steady and exhausting rhythm as the seasons began to turn. The morning air was always crisp and filled with the scent of dry hay and the damp wool of the sheep. This was a time of simple and heavy labor, where the success of the day was measured by the number of fence posts driven into the rocky soil and the health of the cattle in the barn. The atmosphere here was bright, physical, and quiet. The ground beneath John's boots was a path of hard-packed dirt that led from the house to the stables, a trail he walked so often he could find it in his sleep. The air tasted of well water and the dusty smell of the plains. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic beat of the axe hitting wood and the distant calling of the birds in the high trees. John spent his days trying to be the man Abigail wanted him to be, a man who belonged to the land rather than the shadow. This part of the history is a story of the quiet struggle, a realization that the hardest work was not the lifting of the beams, but the staying in one place. As the months passed, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and sharp recollection. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving with a speed and purpose that didn't belong to a simple ranch hand. It was Sadie Adler, a woman who had transformed from a grieving widow into one of the most feared bounty hunters in the territory. She found John in the yard, her face weathered by the sun, and her eyes filled with the same cold fire he remembered from the old days. This was the era of the returning past, where the atmosphere was one of leather, gun oil, and secrets. You see the way she looked at the ranch, a look that told John she brought news from a world he had promised to leave behind. This part of the history is a story of the bounty hunter's lead, a realization that the man who had betrayed the family, Micah Bell, had been spotted in the mountains to the north. The sound of her spurs hitting the dirt was a sharp and metallic note, a noise that signaled the end of the quiet year. Deep within the kitchen of the farmhouse that evening, the atmosphere became cramped and incredibly tense. Sadie sat at the wooden table John had built, laying out maps and talking about revenge, while Abigail watched from the shadows of the hallway. This was the trial of the broken vow, where the atmosphere became one of hushed voices and the weight of a heavy choice. The warriors found that the peace they had built was being pulled apart by the need for a final reckoning. The sound of the wind rattling the window panes was a constant and dry hiss, making the warm house feel like a fragile shell. This part of the history is a realization that John was caught between the love for his wife and the duty he felt toward the memory of Arthur Morgan. He felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the promise he had made to Abigail, a feeling of total and grounded conflict as he looked at the map. The argument that followed after Sadie left was a story of a house divided by the truth. Abigail reminded John of everything they had sacrificed to reach this plateau, the friends they had buried, and the miles they had run to find a name of their own. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating with emotion. This was the trial of the family's peace, where the atmosphere became one of tears and the sound of a closing door. You see the way the light of the single lantern cast long, jagged shadows against the walls of the home. The sound of the silence that followed was a sharp and piercing note, making the ranch feel like the inside of a tomb. This part of the history is a realization that to kill the ghost of the past, John might have to lose the future he was standing in. He felt the steady ache in his hands and the constant pressure of the guilt against his mind, realizing that the survival of his soul required him to finish what started in the mountains years ago. Despite the pain it caused, the journey led to the preparation for the hunt. John met with Charles Smith by the barn, the two men checking their rifles and cinching their saddles under the light of a pale moon. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and lethal, a realization that they were no longer farmers. This part of the history is a story of the old guard, where the atmosphere is one of hard leather and the clicking of ammunition into the chambers. You see the way the horses stood still in the cold night, their breath forming clouds of steam that drifted away in the wind. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt, and the heavy scent of the high peaks they were about to climb. The sound of the horses' hooves as they walked out of the gate was a dull and respectful thud, signaling that the ranch hand was gone and the outlaw had returned. The ride toward the mountains was a story of a long and silent memory. John, Charles, and Sadie rode together, their silhouettes looking like dark shadows against the rising sun. This was a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that this was the final ride of the old circle. This part of the history is a story of the Revenge's Trail, where the tradition of the gang's justice met the reality of the lone survivor. The sound of the wind through the canyons was a sharp and hollow note, making the riders feel solid and heavy as they left the warmth of the valley behind. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, realizing that the way of the land was now a path of the bullet once more. Deep in the heart of the high country, the final trial of the fifth part took place as they found the first signs of Micah's new gang. They found a camp of men who were as brutal and lost as the world they lived in. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the target was close. This is a story of the sovereignty of the nearing end, where they watched the campfires from a ridge and realized that the man they sought was just over the next peak. The conversation was short and focused on the strategy for the climb. The sound of a distant wolf howling was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was waiting in the ice. They had left the house of wood and stone for a world of stone and blood. The experience of the departure from Beecher's hope ends, with John looking back at the distant, flat plains where his family waited. Gold of the ranch had led to a sovereignty of the Gray Mountain. He carried the weight of the betrayal and the silence of the goodbye. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the executioner. The focus would now shift to the climb into the frozen peaks and the final confrontation with the man who destroyed the family, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the ice into a world of final shots, falling snow, and the closing of the account. The final legacy of the fifth part of the fall is a story of the strength in the heavy choice. You have seen the survivor leave the peace of the field to find the justice within the mountain. You have felt the sting of the wind and the weight of the promise. As the orange glow of the morning sun faded into the white light of the high snow, and the first cold flakes fell on the riders, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of John Marston finds its fifth resolution in the decision to seek the truth, leaving behind the world of the plow for a world of the rifle, the frost, and a journey that was reaching its ultimate end. The climb into the high, frozen peaks of Mount Hagen was a journey back into a world that John Marston had tried to forget. The air here was no longer filled with the warmth of the plains, but with a bitter, thin, and sharp cold that seemed to freeze the breath in his lungs. The atmosphere was one of absolute and deadly intent, a realization that the peace of the ranch was now 1,000 miles away. The ground beneath the horses was a treacherous layer of packed ice and deep, shifting snow that hid the edges of narrow cliffs. The air tasted of nothing but frost and the dry, metallic scent of the rifles. The sound of the world was a low and constant whistle, the sound of the wind cutting through the jagged stone ridges like a warning. John led the small group upward, his head bowed against the stinging spray of the ice, realizing that the mountain was a graveyard waiting for new arrivals. This part of the history is a story of the frozen vengeance, where the survivor returned to the ice to finish the work that the mountain started years ago. As the group reached the lower camps of the new gang, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and lethal violence. They found a line of men who were well armed and prepared to die for a leader who cared nothing for them. This was the era of the final shootout, where the atmosphere was one of whistling lead and splintering stone. You see the way the muzzle flashes lit up the gray fog of the mountain, marking the path they had to take. This part of the history is a story of the climb through the fire, a realization that every yard of the mountain had to be paid for in blood. The sound of the rifle cracks was a sharp and repeating note, a noise that echoed across the valleys and told the world that the past had arrived. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, his boots finding grip on the slippery rock as he pushed forward, feeling the steady heat of the gunpowder and the raw weight of the duty. He felt toward the man who died to save him. Deep within a narrow stone canyon halfway up the peak, the atmosphere became cramped and suffocating. Charles Smith was struck by a sniper's bullet, the force of the impact throwing him against the cold rock. The atmosphere became one of intense and heavy dread, a realization that the cost of this journey was growing too high. The warriors found that they were being hunted from above, trapped in a space where there was no cover from the falling lead. The sound of the wind through the canyon was a deep and grating howl, making the pass feel like the inside of a stone throat. This part of the history is a realization that the mountain did not want them to reach the summit. John had to leave his friend behind in the snow, a moment of raw and essential choice. He felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the grief against his chest, a feeling of total and grounded focus as he continued the ascent with Sadie Adler. At the edge of the high timberline, the group encountered a massive barricade of logs and ice. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and freezing as the defenders poured fire down on them from the heights. This was the trial of the final gate, where the atmosphere became one of physical strain and the spray of frost. John and Sadie worked together, their movements synchronized by years of surviving the worst the world could offer. The sound of the grenades hitting the timber was a deep and final boom, making the air feel like it was filled with the vibration of the mountain. When the path was finally cleared, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and misted stillness. They were standing at the base of the final peak, the place where the man they sought was hiding in a small wooden shack that looked like a casket on the ridge. The walk toward the shack was a story of a solemn and hardened march. John was alone now, as Sadie had been wounded in the final push. He moved across the open snow, his silhouette a dark and solitary shadow against the white void. This is a moment of raw and private reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the conversation of a lifetime was about to take place. This part of the history is a story of the summit of the truth, where the tradition of the outlaw's justice met the reality of the final betrayal. The sound of his boots on the frozen crust of the snow was a dull and respectful thud, making John feel solid and heavy in a world that was trying to blow him away. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand reaching for the latch of the door, realizing that the way of the gun had led him back to the very beginning. Inside the shack, the atmosphere became intimate, cold, and tense. John found the man he had been hunting, standing in the shadows with a look of arrogant and empty amusement. This was the trial of the final confrontation, where the atmosphere became one of held breaths and the clicking of hammers. The air was still and carried the taste of old smoke and rotting timber. The sound of the man's voice was a thin and piercing note, making the small room feel like the inside of a waiting trap. This part of the history is a realization that the man had not changed. He was still the viper in the garden who had poisoned the family. John felt the steady ache in the hands and the constant pressure of the anger behind his eyes, a feeling of total and grounded justice. The standoff was interrupted when another figure emerged from the back of the room. It was the old leader, the man who had taught them everything and then lost his way in the fog of his own mind. The atmosphere was vast, silent, and lethal, a realization that the three ghosts were finally in the same room. This is a story of the sovereignty of the final meeting, where the silence between the men was louder than any gunshot. They looked at each other, seeing the wreckage of a life in the lines of their faces. The sound of the wind hitting the walls of the shack was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was the time they had wasted on a lie. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes fixed on the man who had betrayed them all, realizing that the only way home was through the blood of the past. The experience at the summit ends with the final shots being fired, the smoke filling the small room until it was gray and blinding. The white of the snow had led to a sovereignty of the black lead. He carried the weight of the long hunt and the silence of the resolution. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the vengeance was now a path of the empty hands. The focus would now shift to the return to the valley, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the sunset into a world of the rebuilt home, the forgiven promise, and the final realization that the past is never truly buried. The final legacy of the sixth part of The Fall is a story of the strength in the final act. You have seen the survivor climb the mountain and find the ending with within the ice. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the rifle. As the golden glow of the high sun faded into the evening shadows of the peak, and the first stars appeared over the range, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of John Marston finds its sixth and grounded resolution in the closing of the book, leaving behind the world of the mountain for a world of the farm, the family, and a journey that was finally reaching its true and quiet home. The ride down from the high peaks of Mount Hagen was a journey from the world of ice back into the world of the living. John Marston felt the air change with every mile his horse descended, moving from the sharp and freezing wind of the summit to the soft and cool breeze of the mountain valleys. The atmosphere here was one of heavy relief, quiet, and a strange kind of peace. The ground beneath the horses was no longer the treacherous ice of the peak, but a mix of pine needles and damp earth that muffled the sound of their travel. The air tasted of wood smoke and the sweet scent of the trees waking up in the morning light. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic beat of the horses breathing and the distant sound of falling water. John rode with Sadie and Charles, their silhouettes looking like dark shadows against the rising sun. This part of the history is a story of the final return, a realization that the debt of the past had been paid in full at the top of that mountain. As they reached the lower hills, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet recovery. They stopped to rest by a stream, the water clear and cold as it moved over the gray stones. This was a time of healing for the group, a period where the intensity of the hunt was replaced by the simple need to stay upright. You see the way they sat by the water, their faces weathered and tired, looking at the world with eyes that had seen the end of an era. The air was fresh and carried the taste of mountain grass and the dry scent of the high country. This part of the history is a story of the shared silence, a realization that the three of them were the last echoes of a family that had once covered the entire land. The sound of the water was a sharp and musical note, a noise that seemed to wash away the smell of gunpowder and the memory of the blood in the snow. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his hands steady as he washed the dirt from his face, feeling the steady heat of the sun on his back and the raw weight of the home he was heading toward. The journey back to the heartlands was a story of the open road. John left his friends at the crossroads, watching as Sadie and Charles headed toward their own futures in different parts of the world. The atmosphere became vast, open, and solitary. This was the trial of the lone traveler, where the atmosphere was one of wide horizons and the smell of the coming rain. The warrior found that the land was changing, with new fences and small towns appearing where there had once been only grass. The sound of his horse's hooves on the dry road was a constant and rhythmic thud, making the plains feel like a drum that beat out the passage of time. This part of the history is a realization that the world of the outlaw was truly gone, and only the world of the settler remained. John felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the hope in his chest, a feeling of total and grounded focus as he saw the familiar shape of the hills near his home. As he rode through the gate of Beecher's Hope, the atmosphere shifted to one of absolute and nervous expectation. He found the ranch sitting quiet under the afternoon sun, the wood of the house looking pale and strong against the blue sky. This was the trial of the homecoming, where the atmosphere was one of held breaths and the sound of the wind in the porch chimes. You see the way he stopped his horse and looked at the door, wondering if the man who returned from the mountain was a man his family could still love. The air was warm and carried the taste of dry sage and the heavy scent of the barn. This part of the history is a story of the forgiven promise, a realization that the home he built was still waiting for its heart. The sound of the front door opening was a sharp and final note, a noise that signaled the end of his long exile. The reunion in the yard was a story of a family made whole again. Abigail came out onto the porch, her eyes searching his face for the shadow of the man he used to be. The atmosphere was violent, with emotion bright and suffocating with the weight of the years they had spent running. This was the trial of the final embrace, where the atmosphere became one of soft whispers and the spray of tears. The sound of Jack's voice calling his father's name was a thin and joyful note, making the dusty yard feel like the center of the entire world. This part of the history is a realization that the sacrifice of Arthur Morgan had finally found its purpose in the peace of this family. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, holding his wife and son close, realizing that the way of the gun had finally led him to the door of the life he was meant to live. The months that followed were a story of the brief and golden years. The atmosphere at the ranch was one of humble toil and the quiet joy of the everyday. They spent their days working the land, raising the cattle, and sitting on the porch as the sun went down over the plateau. This was a moment of raw and private reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that they had achieved the impossible. This part of the history is a story of the perfect peace, where the tradition of the wanderer met the reality of the owner. The sound of the hammer hitting the fence posts was a dull and respectful thud, making John feel solid and heavy in a world that was no longer trying to kill him. He moved with a sturdy and measured power, his hand resting on the wood of the house he had built, realizing that the way of the survivor was now a path of the guardian. Deep in the heart of the farmhouse at night, the final trial of the 7th part took place as John and Abigail sat by the fire, talking about the future. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that they were no longer afraid of the dark. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared home, where the smell of the cedar wood and the sound of the fire popping in the grate filled the rooms. The conversation was hopeful and focused on the simple things: the next harvest, the growth of their son, and the beauty of the high plains. The sound of the wind hitting the glass in the windows was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy of the past was finally being kept outside. They were a family of the land, and for a few years, the world was exactly as it should be. The experience at Beecher's Hope ends with John and Abigail standing on the ridge together, looking out over the valley as the moon rose over the trees. The gold of the day had led to a sovereignty of the silver night. They carried the weight of the joy and the silence of the peace. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the outlaws had finally reached its destination. The focus would now shift to the marriage and the final legalizing of their name. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the happiness into a world of church bells, local friends, and the final gathering of the light before the shadows returned. The final legacy of the seventh part of the fall is a story of the strength in the return. You have seen the warrior come back from the war and find the peace within his own house. You have felt the sting of the memory and the weight of the love. As the orange glow of the house lights faded into the shadows of the evening and the first stars appeared over the heartlands, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of John Marston finds its seventh resolution in the peace of the family, leaving behind the world of the ice for a world of the grass, the sun, and a journey that had finally found its anchor in the earth. The peace of Beecher's Hope was broken on a day when the sky was a hard, flat blue, and the air was unusually still. John Marston was working near the barn, the smell of dry hay and horse sweat filling the air, when he saw the dark shapes of wagons and horses appearing on the horizon. This was not the arrival of friends or neighbors. The atmosphere here was cold, heavy, and filled with a sudden, sharp dread. The ground beneath his boots felt solid, yet he felt as though the earth was shifting away from him. The air tasted of dust and the metallic scent of a world that was closing in. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic thrum of many hooves hitting the dry road, a noise that signaled the end of the quiet years. John stood his ground, his hand resting on the wooden fence, realizing that the law had finally found the man who thought he was hidden. As the men drew closer, the atmosphere shifted to one of absolute and official power. These were not the local sheriffs of the nearby towns, but agents of the government led by a man named Edgar Ross. They wore dark suits and carried themselves with a cold, mechanical authority that didn't belong to the wild plains. This was the era of the modern hunter, where the atmosphere was one of paper warrants and the glint of federal badges. You see the way they surrounded the house, their figures looking like black marks against the golden grass. This part of the history is a story of the forced return, a realization that the government did not care about the man John had become, only the man he used to be. The sound of the lead agent's voice was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that demanded the total surrender of the survivor. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his face a mask of calm, feeling the steady heat of the sun on his neck and the raw weight of the threat to his family. Deep within the yard of the ranch, the atmosphere became cramped and incredibly suffocating. The agents made it clear that they had taken Abigail and Jack as a way to ensure John's cooperation. This was the trial of the ultimate leverage, where the atmosphere became one of helpless fury and the smell of the dry dirt. The warriors found that the walls of the home were no protection against a government that could take everything with a single word. The sound of the wind through the eaves of the house was a constant and dry hiss, making the beautiful ranch feel like a cage. This part of the history is a realization that to save his wife and son, John had to go back into the world of the gun one last time. He felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the fear for his family, a feeling of total and grounded desperation as he accepted the deal. The deal was a story of a long and bloody list. Edgar Ross wanted the remaining members of the old group, Bill Williamson and Javier Escula, and he wanted John to hunt them down. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and cold with the reality of the task. This was the trial of the brothers' betrayal, where the atmosphere became one of lead and the spray of dust. John had to leave his home and his land to go into the territory of New Austin, a place of red rocks and burning sun where the past was still alive. The sound of the train whistle as he was taken away from Blackwater was a thin and lonely note, making the distance between him and his family feel like a canyon that could never be crossed. This part of the history is a realization that the cycle of violence was starting again, and this time, the law was the one pulling the trigger. The journey through the desert of New Austin was a story of a scorched and lonely path. John rode through the canyons and the brush, his silhouette looking like a dark shadow against the red stone. This was a moment of raw and private reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that he was a prisoner who was allowed to carry a gun. This part of the history is a story of the government's shadow, where the tradition of the outlaw met the reality of the hired hunter. The sound of the cicadas in the heat was a constant and high-pitched drone, signaling that the world was watching the survivor work. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his eyes fixed on the fortresses where his old friends were hiding, realizing that the way of the land was now a path of the necessary execution. As he reached the walls of Fort Mercer, where Bill Williamson had gathered a new gang of killers, the atmosphere shifted to one of lethal confrontation. John stood before the gate, his voice calling out to the man he had once called a brother. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and dangerous. This was the trial of the old ties, where the atmosphere became one of mocking laughter and the sound of rifles being cocked. You see the way the dust swirled around his boots, making him look like a ghost that had returned from the grave. The sound of the first shot being fired from the wall was a sharp and final crack, making the desert feel like the inside of a furnace. John fell in the dirt, wounded and alone, realizing that the hunt was going to be much harder and bloodier than the agents had promised. Deep in the heart of the desert night, the final trial of the 8th part took place as a local rancher named Bonnie McFarlane found John and saved his life. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that he had found an ally in a land of enemies. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared kindness, where the smell of the medicine and the sound of the cattle in the distance filled the room. The conversation was quiet and focused on the work of the ranch and the danger of the outlaws nearby. The sound of the wind hitting the wooden walls of the barn was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was still waiting at the fort. John lay in the bed, his body healing, but his mind fixed on the deal he had made, realizing that every day he spent in New Austin was a day his family spent in a cell. The experience in the desert ends with John standing on the porch of the McFarlane Ranch, looking toward the distant mountains where the outlaws lived. The red of the sun had led to a sovereignty of the deep purple twilight. He carried the weight of the debt and the silence of the mission. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the law's weapon. The focus would now shift to the gathering of a new group of allies and the eventual storming of the fort. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the heat into a world of Gatling guns, local legends, and the final destruction of the men who stayed in the past. The final legacy of the 8th part of The Fall is a story of the strength in the forced journey. You have seen the survivor lose his peace and find the duty within the red dirt. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the federal badge. As the orange glow of the desert moon faded into the shadows of the hills, and the first cold air of the night reached the ranch, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of John Marston finds its 8th resolution in the start of the hunt, leaving behind the world of the home for a world of the dust, the sun, and a journey that was turning back into a war for the survival of those he loved. The hunt for the remaining brothers of the old life led John Marston across the dry, sun-cracked earth of New Austin. The air here was a heavy weight of heat that carried the scent of dry sage and the sharp, metallic tang of the desert. This was a land of red rocks and deep canyons where the law was thin and the outlaws lived like kings in stone castles. The atmosphere was one of vast, silent, and burning tension. The ground beneath the horses was a fine red dust that rose in clouds with every step, coating John's clothes until he looked like a ghost made of the earth itself. The sound of the world was a constant and high-pitched buzz of the cicadas in the brush, a noise that felt like a timer counting down to a final explosion. This part of the history is a story of the gathering storm, a realization that to take the fort, John had to become the leader he never wanted to be. To break the walls of Fort Mercer, John had to find allies among the strange and broken people of the desert. He met a traveling salesman named Nigel West Dickens, a gravel robber named Seth, and a drunkard named Irish. the atmosphere shifted to one of desperate and dirty planning. They were not warriors, but they were the only help John had in a land that wanted him dead. This was the era of the hidden trap, where the atmosphere was one of grease, wood splinters, and the smell of cheap whiskey. You see the way they worked together to rebuild an old Gatling gun and hide it inside a merchant's wagon. This part of the history is a story of the Trojan horse, a realization that the power of the government was nothing compared to the trickery of the desperate. The sound of the Gatling gun being oiled was a sharp and metallic click, a noise that signaled the coming of the lead. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes fixed on the distant walls of the fort, feeling the steady heat of the sun on his neck and the raw weight of the mission. The attack on Fort Mercer was a story of a sudden and overwhelming fire. John drove the wagon right to the front gates, the atmosphere violent, bright, and suffocating with the dust and the heat. This was the trial of the hidden weapon, where the atmosphere became one of whistling lead and the spray of stone. When the tarp was pulled back and the Gatling gun began to roar, the desert air was filled with the taste of gunpowder and the smell of hot oil. The warriors found that the outlaws inside the fort were caught in a storm of iron they couldn't escape. The sound of the gun was a deep and final rattle, making the fort feel like the inside of a crashing machine. This part of the history is a realization that Bill Williamson's reign of terror was over. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand on the trigger, realizing that the survival of his family was worth the destruction of his old friend's home. After the smoke cleared and the fort was taken, they found that Bill Williamson had already fled south. The atmosphere shifted to a heavy and adrenaline-soaked stillness. They discovered that Bill had crossed the San Luis River into the territory of Mexico, seeking protection from Javier Escula and a local general. This was the trial of the long chase, where the atmosphere became one of wide horizons and the deep blue of the river. John stood on the bank, looking across the water at the red cliffs of the south, realizing that the agents of the government would not let him rest until he crossed that line. The sound of the water moving over the rocks was a low and constant moan, signaling that the hunt was moving into a land of even deeper shadows. The crossing into Mexico was a story of a dangerous and beautiful passage. John and Irish used a small raft to move across the water under the light of a full moon. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and lethal, as they were attacked by shooters from the high cliffs. This part of the history is a story of the border of the past, where the atmosphere is one of splashing water and the sharp crack of rifles. You see the way the moonlight reflected off the ripples of the river, looking like silver glass in the dark. The air was cool and carried the taste of salt and the dry scent of the Mexican hills. The sound of the bullets hitting the wood of the raft was a sharp and ringing snap, making the crossing feel like a journey into the belly of a new war. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his rifle clearing the cliffs, realizing that the way of the land was now a path into a revolution. The walk onto the southern shore was a story of a new and burning reality. John found himself in a land of whitewashed walls, red clay, and a war between a corrupt army and a group of rebels. This was a moment of raw and physical change. The atmosphere was somber and still, a realization that he had to play both sides to find his targets. This part of the history is a story of the stranger in a strange land, where the tradition of the outlaw met the reality of the soldier. The sound of his horse's hooves on the dry, baked earth of Mexico was a dull and respectful thud, making John feel solid and heavy in a world that was being torn apart by fire. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun, realizing that the only way back to his wife and son was through the heart of the Mexican sun. Deep in the heart of the town of Chuparosa, the final trial of the ninth part took place as John met a legendary rebel leader named Landon Ricketts. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that he had found a man who understood the old ways of the gun. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared skill, where they stood in the dirt street and practiced the draw under the noon sun. The conversation was quiet and focused on the weight of the choice and the cost of the piece. The sound of the wind through the arches of the stone buildings was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was still waiting in the hills. John stood in the dust, his eyes narrowing against the glare, realizing that the trail of the traitor was finally getting warm. The experience in Mexico ends with John looking toward the high fortress of Escalera on the horizon. The red of the cliffs had led to a sovereignty of the orange dust. He carried the weight of the long pursuit and the silence of the distant home. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the foreign war. The focus would now shift to the betrayal of the general and the capture of Javier Escula. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the iron into a world of execution squads, burning villas, and the final realization that no matter where you go, the past is always waiting at the gate. The final legacy of the ninth part of The Fall is a story of the strength in the relentless drive. You have seen the survivor cross the water and find the conflict within the southern hills. You have felt the sting of the sun and the weight of the rifle. As the golden glow of the Mexican sunset faded into the shadows of the canyons and the first stars appeared over the desert, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of John Marston finds its ninth and grounded resolution in the arrival in the south, leaving behind the world of the fort for a world of the villa, the sun, and a journey that was becoming a march toward the end of the list. The hunt for the remaining members of the old family took John Marston deep into the heart of a country on fire. Mexico was a land of white stone walls and red clay that felt like it was being baked by a sun that never cooled. The atmosphere here was thick with the scent of dry earth, roasted peppers, and the sharp, oily smell of old rifles. The ground beneath the horses was a hard, sun-cracked dirt that felt as solid as rock, making every step of the journey feel heavy and permanent. The air tasted of salt and the dry dust that blew off the high mesas. The sound of the world was a constant, and low hum of the wind moving through the arches of the stone towns, making the entire land feel like a place that was waiting for a change. John moved through this world as a man with a single purpose, realizing that to get back to his own home, he had to help decide the fate of another. This part of the history is a story of the Foreign War, where the survivor found himself caught between a corrupt army and a group of rebels. As John worked for both the local army officers and the rebel leaders to find his targets, the atmosphere shifted to one of dangerous double-crossing. He found himself riding with General DeSanta, a man who loved the power of his uniform more than the people he was supposed to protect. This was the era of the villa and the trench, where the atmosphere was one of polite smiles and hidden execution squads. You see the way the sunlight hit the polished silver of the officers' saddles, casting bright flashes across the red dust of the roads. This part of the history is a story of the Hollow Alliance, a realization that the men in power were just as lawless as the outlaws they were hunting. The sound of the soldiers marching on the timber bridges was a sharp and rhythmic thud, a noise that signaled the coming of a great violence. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his face a mask of calm, feeling the steady heat of the sun on his back and the raw weight of the lies he had to tell to find Javier Escula. The search for Javier eventually led to a massive stone fortress in the hills called El Presidio. The atmosphere became cramped, loud, and incredibly violent as the rebels launched an attack on the walls. This was the trial of the ancient gates, where the atmosphere became one of black powder smoke and the screaming of horses. The warriors found that the fortress was a maze of thick stone and dark cells, a place where secrets were kept and lives were forgotten. The sound of the cannons hitting the walls was a deep and bone-shaking boom, making the ground feel like it was jumping under their feet. This part of the history is a realization that Javier had been hiding in the shadow of the army all along. When John finally cornered his old friend in a dark corridor, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and somber stillness. He looked at the man he had once called a brother and saw only a ghost of the past. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, securing Javier for the agents, realizing that the circle was finally closing. With Javier captured, the focus turned to the final target in the south, Bill Williamson. Bill was hiding with the leader of the local army, Colonel Linde, in a massive villa surrounded by guards. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating with the smell of smoke as the rebels moved to take the villa by force. This was the trial of the last stand, where the atmosphere became one of falling stone and the roar of a massive fire. You see the way the orange flames climbed the white walls of the estate, lighting up the night sky like a second sun. The sound of the Gatling guns tearing through the wooden doors was a sharp and constant rattle, making the villa feel like it was being shredded by an invisible wind. This part of the history is a story of the end of the road, where the man who had caused so much pain in the desert finally ran out of places to hide. The final confrontation at the villa was a story of a quick and final justice. John stood in the smoke as Bill and Linde tried to flee in a horse-drawn coach. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and lethal for a single moment before the chase began. This part of the history is a story of the stopped wheels, where the atmosphere is one of hard breathing and the dry taste of the dirt. You see the way the coach overturned in the road, leaving the targets exposed in the open light of the morning. The air was warm and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of charred timber. The sound of the final shots being fired was a sharp and ringing snap, signaling that the names on the government's list were almost all crossed out. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, looking down at the men who had once been his family, realizing that the way of the gun was a path that only led to a hole in the ground. The journey back toward the border was a story of a heavy and reflective ride. John had done what the agents asked, but he felt no joy in the victory. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the world he was returning to was not the same one he had left. This part of the history is a story of the long return, where the tradition of the survivor met the reality of the price he had paid. The sound of the river moving between the two countries was a low and musical note, making the crossing feel like a journey between two different lives. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand resting on the neck of his horse, realizing that the way of the land was now a path of the final reckoning. He had the brothers he was sent for, and now he had to face the man who had started it all. Deep in the heart of the government office in Blackwater a few days later, the final trial of the 10th part took place as Edgar Ross gave John his final mission. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the job was not over. This is a story of the sovereignty of the last name, where the agent told John that he had to find Dutch van der Linde himself. The conversation was short and filled with the smell of stale paper and the sound of the city outside. The sound of the ticking clock on the wall was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was still waiting in the mountains to the north. John stood in the office, his eyes fixed on the man in the suit, realizing that the survival of his family required him to kill the man who had given him a name in the first place. The experience in Mexico and the return to the city ends with John looking toward the high, snow-capped peaks of the mountains on the horizon. The red of the desert had led to a sovereignty of the gray stone. He carried the weight of the betrayal and the silence of the long road. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the final hunt. The focus would now shift to the climb into the snowy ridges, and the final battle with the old leader. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the frost into a world of mountain fortresses, high-speed chases, and the final realization that the past never truly lets go. The final legacy of the 10th part of The Fall is a story of the strength in the completed task. You have seen the outlaws lose their brothers and find the truth within the smoke of the villa. You have felt the sting of the sun and the weight of the choice. As the gold glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the city buildings, and the first cold wind of the north reached the streets, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of John Marston finds its 10th resolution in the crossing of the names, leaving behind the world of the south for a world of the mountain, the ice, and a journey that was reaching its ultimate and tragic peak. The hunt for the last man of the old life led John Marston away from the heat of the south and back toward the cold, gray shadows of the northern mountains. The air here was a heavy weight of mist that carried the scent of pine needles, wet stone, and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming winter. This was a land of high ridges and hidden caves, where the old leader had gathered a new group of angry young men to fight a war against the world. The atmosphere was one of vast, silent, and frozen dread. The ground beneath the horses was a mix of dark mud, and the first white dusting of snow that crunched with every step, making the path feel like it was made of bone. The sound of the world was a constant and low whistle of the wind through the high canyons, a noise that felt like a long-drawn breath before a final scream. This part of the history is a story of the final mountain, a realization that the ghost of the past was waiting in the clouds. To reach the fortress of the old leader, John had to join forces with a small army of soldiers and federal agents. The atmosphere shifted to one of cold and mechanical war. These were not the outlaws John was used to, but men in blue uniforms who moved with a rigid and unfeeling precision. This was the era of the modern machine, where the atmosphere was one of iron, oil, and the smell of smoke. You see the way they dragged the massive mountain guns up the narrow trails, their wheels cutting deep ruts into the frozen earth. This part of the history is a story of the closing net, a realization that the freedom of the wilderness was being crushed by the weight of the new century. The sound of the soldiers, boots marching in unison, was a sharp and rhythmic thud, a noise that signaled the end of the individual. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes fixed on the high peak above, feeling the steady cold on his face and the raw weight of the duty he felt toward the wife and son he was trying to buy back. The attack on the mountain fortress was a story of a brutal and vertical battle. John and the soldiers had to climb through a maze of wooden bridges and stone tunnels while fire rained down on them from above. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating with the dust of the falling rocks. This was the trial of the high ground, where the atmosphere became one of whistling lead and the spray of splinters. When the mountain guns began to roar, the air was filled with the taste of gunpowder and the smell of burning timber. The warriors found that the young men following the old leader were fighting with a desperate and lost fury. The sound of the explosions echoing in the canyons was a deep and final boom, making the mountain feel like the inside of a crashing heart. This part of the history is a realization that the dream of the old life was being burned out of the stone. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his rifle clearing the way toward the summit, realizing that the survival of his future required the death of his history. After the lower defenses were broken, the journey led to a high-speed chase through the heart of the mountain. John pursued the old leader through the dark tunnels, their horses' hooves sparking against the stone in the dim light of the lanterns. The atmosphere shifted to a heavy and adrenaline-soaked stillness every time they rounded a corner. This was the trial of the father and the son, where the atmosphere became one of muffled footsteps and the smell of old blood. The warriors found that they were no longer fighting for money or land, but for the final word in a 20-year argument. The sound of the old leader's voice echoing through the caves was a thin and haunting note, signaling that the man was finally losing his grip on the world. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his shadow dancing on the walls, realizing that the way of the land was leading them to the edge of the world. The final confrontation took place at the very peak of the mountain, on a narrow ledge overlooking a drop that vanished into the morning mist. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and lethal, as the two men stood facing each other with the wind howling between them. This part of the history is a story of the edge of the void, where the atmosphere is one of held breaths and the dry taste of the air. You see the way the old leader looked at John, his eyes no longer filled with the fire of a king, but with the tired peace of a man who was ready to stop running. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and the scent of the high clouds. The sound of the old leader's last speech was a soft and respectful tone, making the mountain feel like the inside of a sacred place. He told John that they couldn't fight nature, and they couldn't fight change. The walk toward the ledge was a story of a final and silent surrender. The old leader stepped back, his silhouette a dark and fatting shadow against the white mist. This is a moment of raw and private finality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the long war was finally over. This part of the history is a story of the falling star, where the tradition of the leader met the reality of the gravity. The sound of the man's body hitting the rocks below was a dull and final thud, signaling that the names on the government's list were all crossed out but one. John stood on the edge, his hat in his hand, looking down into the gruff void where his father figure had disappeared. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun, realizing that the way of the gun had finally led to the silence of the summit. Deep in the heart of the mountain at dawn, the final trial of the 11th part took place as Edgar Russ and the soldiers arrived at the ledge. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the agents had what they wanted. This is a story of the sovereignty of the completed deal, where they looked at the body in the snow and realized that the era of the outlaws was officially dead. The conversation was short and focused on the release of the family. The sound of the wind through the rocks was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was now the men in the suits who stood beside him. John stood in the light of the rising sun, his eyes fixed on the path back to the valley, realizing that the only way home was to believe that the government would keep its word. The experience at the mountain ends with John riding away from the peak, leaving the soldiers to clean up the wreckage. The grah of the stone had led to a sovereignty of the golden morning. He carried the weight of the old man's death and the silence of the final mission. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the hunter was now a path of the father. The focus would now shift to the return to Beecher's hope. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the sunset into a world of the reunited family, the quiet chores, and the final realization that even the hunter is eventually hunted. The final legacy of the 11th part of the fall is a story of the strength in the final ending. You have seen the survivor face the man who made him and find the peace within the fall. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the rifle. As the orange glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the valley, and the first warm air of the plains reached the rider, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of John Muston finds its 11th and grounded resolution in the death of Dutch, leaving behind the world of the mountain for a world of the farm, the home, and a journey that was reaching its final, quiet plateau. The return to Beecher's hope was a journey into a light that John Muston thought he would never see again. The air was soft, warm, and filled with the scent of blossoming flowers and the sweet, dry grass of the high plains. This was a time of pure and quiet joy, where the man who had been a weapon for the government was finally allowed to be a husband and a father. The atmosphere here was bright, peaceful, and sacred. The ground beneath his boots was the familiar, firm earth of his own yard, a place he had built with his own sweat and blood. The air tasted of clean water and the honest smell of the horses in the barn. The sound of the world was a low and constant song, the sound of Abigail's laughter and the rhythmic thud of Jack's chores, making the entire ranch feel like a colossal, natural sanctuary. John spent his days teaching his son how to hunt, and his evenings sitting on the porch with his wife, realizing that in this quiet life, he had finally found the redemption he had been searching for since the mountains of the north. As the weeks passed in a golden haze of simple work, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and chilling realization. One afternoon, the birds stopped singing, and the wind died down to a heavy, expectant silence. This was the era of the final betrayal, where the atmosphere was one of hidden eyes and the glint of steel. You see the way the dust rose on the horizon, signaling the arrival of a massive force of soldiers and federal agents. This part of the history is a story of the broken word, a realization that the government did not want a retired outlaw. They wanted a world where people like John Muston no longer existed. The sound of the first hoofbeat on the road was a sharp and final note, a noise that marked the end of the piece. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes finding the rifles hidden in the trees, feeling the steady heat of the sun and the raw weight of the duty. He felt toward the family he had to save one last time. Deep within the ranch house, as the bullets began to fly, the atmosphere became cramped, loud, and lethal. John and Uncle fought side by side to hold the doors, the air filling with the choking scent of gunpowder and splintered wood. This was the trial of the last stand of the Old West, where the atmosphere was one of frantic motion and the spray of lead. The warriors found that the army was not interested in a fair fight. They were there to erase the past. The sound of the soldiers shouting was a deep and grating roar, making the farmhouse feel like the inside of a falling fortress. This part of the history is a realization that the circle was finally closing around the last of the brothers. He felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the fear for his family, a feeling of total and grounded focus as he pushed Abigail and Jack toward the back of the barn. At the edge of the barn, John made the choice that would define his legacy. He stayed behind to hold the line, telling his wife and son to ride as fast as they could toward the mountains. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and final as he watched the horse disappear into the trees. This was the trial of the ultimate sacrifice, where the atmosphere became one of absolute silence and the taste of iron. John stood alone in the dark of the barn, his shadow a long and solid mark against the hay. The sound of the soldiers taking their positions outside was a sharp and metallic rattle, making the air feel like it was filled with the weight of 1,000 guns. When he finally pushed open the barn doors to face the firing squad, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and searing stillness. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand on his revolver, realizing that the way of the outlaw ended here, in the dirt of his own home. The final stand of John Muston was a story of a lone man against the machine. He walked out into the yard, his silhouette a dark and defiant shadow against the blue sky. This is a moment of raw and metallic reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the debt was being paid in the only currency the law accepted. This part of the history is a story of the end of the legend, where the tradition of the gun met the reality of the firing line. The sound of the dozens of rifles firing at once was a sharp and deafening crack, signaling that the last member of the Linde gang had fallen. John hit the ground, his blood soaking into the red dirt of Beecher's Hope, making him solid and heavy in a world that was moving on without him. He looked up at the sun one last time, realizing that the only way to be free was to leave the world behind. The walk toward the grave years later was a story of a new and bitter cycle. Jack Muston stood over the wooden crosses on the hill, the wind pulling at his coat. The atmosphere was vast, gras, and haunted. A realization that the son had inherited the father's gun and the father's ghost. This part of the history is a story of the vengeful echo, where the atmosphere is one of cold resolve and the smell of salt. You see the way the young man looked toward the river, where Edgar Russ was spending his retirement. The air was cool and carried the taste of rain and the scent of the high plains. The sound of the grass rustling against the stones was a low and constant moan, signaling that the spirit of the gang was still alive in the blood of the survivor. Deep in the heart of the marshland, where the final duel took place, the final trial of the 12th part was the meeting between Jack and the man who killed his father. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the story was finishing exactly where it began. This is a story of the sovereignty of the final shot, where the boy became the man and the cycle was completed. The conversation was short and filled with the weight of the years. The sound of the final gunshot echoing over the water was a long and lonesome note, signaling that the true enemy had finally been silenced. Jack stood by the river, his eyes fixed on the horizon, realizing that the way of the gun had left him as the last shadow in a world of light. The experience of the fall of the gang ends with a single, silent figure riding away from the river. The gold of the morning had led to a sovereignty of the gras mist. He carried the weight of the father's name and the silence of the final act. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the outlaws was now a path of the memory. The focus would now shift to the endless horizon, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the dust into a world of motorcars, paved roads, and the final realization that the legends of the West were buried deep beneath the soil of the ranch. The final legacy of the 12 parts of the fall is a story of the strength in the final stand. You have seen the warrior give his life to save his family, and the son take up the mantle to find justice. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the dirt. As the orange glow of the sunset faded into the evening shadows of the hill, and the first stars appeared over Beecher's Hope, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the Van de Linde gang finds its 12th and grounded resolution in the sacrifice of the father, leaving behind the world of the gun for a world of the story, the stone, and a journey that had finally reached its ultimate and eternal end.